Who could have imagined that a few dozen men, armed with old rifles, bows, and raw courage, could defy the combined armies of 2 nations? How could the Apache, outnumbered and outgunned, strike with such deadly precision that entire columns of soldiers feared to march into their deserts? The answer lies not in numbers or weapons, but in the art of war that Geronimo and his people mastered, the art of vanishing, striking, and surviving in a land that seemed to kill outsiders but sheltered its own. This was not war as the Americans or the Mexicans understood it. This was war shaped by the desert, taught by mountains, and refined through generations of Apache struggle. To the Apache, the desert was not empty, it was alive, a living ally. Where others saw only barren wasteland, the Apache saw pots, cover, hiding places and traps. A soldier from the east might look at a canyon wall and see stone. Geronimo saw the echo of a hoof, the faint print of a boot, the shadow of water hidden underground. While armies marched in rigid lines, the Apache melted into the landscape, appearing when least expected, disappearing when most feared. This was not a battlefield of formations. It was a chessboard of silence and surprise. Geronimo and his warriors fought with a philosophy as old as the hills: strike swift, strike hard, and never fight where the enemy is strong. They mastered the tactic of hit-and-run warfare. They would wait for the perfect moment, hidden on ridges or among boulders, until a patrol of soldiers stumbled into their chosen ground. Then, like thunder, the Apaches would descend, arrows and bullets raining down from every angle, before the enemy could recover, before officers could rally their men. Geronimo's warriors would vanish back into the rocks, leaving only fear behind. It was more than strategy, it was psychology. Soldiers came to believe. They were being watched at every moment. They could march for days under the burning sun, never seeing a soul, and then in an instant chaos would erupt, comrades falling from unseen gunfire. At night, campfires cast uneasy shadows, and every rustle of wind in the brush felt like Apache eyes. In this way, Geronimo fought not only with weapons, but with terror, making the enemy defeat themselves long before battle began. The Apache also understood mobility better than any army. They traveled light, often carrying little more than a rifle, a bow, and a small pouch of food. They could cover 50 miles in a day, climbing jagged ridges where soldiers with supply wagons could barely crawl. Horses were their lifeblood, swift and agile, trained to move silently at night and endure long stretches without water. When American cavalry pursued them, burdened with supplies and heavy packs, the Apache simply outpaced them, disappearing into terrain so rugged that no column could follow. To chase Geronimo was to chase the wind, yet the genius of their warfare was not only speed, but intelligence. Geronimo used scouts the way a general uses maps. Young warriors, trained since childhood to read the smallest signs, could tell how many soldiers had passed by a trail, how heavy their loads, whether they were tired or ready for battle. A broken branch, the disturbed track of a snake, the angle of a footprint in sand, these were as clear as written reports. With this knowledge, Geronimo always struck where his enemy was weakest. Consider this: in battle after battle, Geronimo's bands were outnumbered 10-1, and yet they survived, sometimes even triumphed, not because they sought open confrontation, but because they turned the land itself into a weapon. Canyons became ambush sites, arroyos became escape routes. The desert sun became an ally that weakened soldiers weighed down by wool uniforms and heavy gear. To Geronimo, every rock, every cactus, every shadow was a tool in his war. It is tempting to call this primitive guerrilla warfare, but in truth, it was anything but primitive. It was a sophisticated, fluid system of survival-based combat, what modern soldiers might call Asymmetrical warfare. In fact, when we look at the strategies of modern insurgencies, whether the guerrillas of Vietnam, the Mujahideen of Afghanistan, or resistance fighters across the world, we see echoes of Geronimo's Apache. Small, mobile units striking supply lines, ambushing convoys. Vanishing into terrain they alone can master, Geronimo was not simply fighting for revenge. He was laying down a blueprint for survival against overwhelming force. And there was something that made soldiers whisper that he was untouchable. Time and again, Geronimo seemed to walk through storms of bullets unharmed. His warriors believed he had been blessed by the spirits, that the prophecy of the desert protected him. Stories spread of soldiers aiming point blank, firing and missing as if the earth itself shielded him. Whether these were exaggerations or not, the effect was undeniable. His men fought harder, convinced they followed a man chosen by fate. His enemies hesitated, haunted by the thought that they faced a warrior who could not die. But make no mistake, this warfare was brutal. Geronimo's raids were swift and merciless. To the Apache, it was war for survival, a fight to preserve their people and their land. To the Mexicans and Americans, it was terror, relentless and unending. Villages feared the sudden thunder of Apache riders, and soldiers dreaded patrols through canyons where death might wait behind every stone. This was the reality of asymmetrical war, glory for none, fear for all. What set Geronimo apart, however, was his mastery not just of tactics, but of the mind. He knew that if he could not win battles of numbers, he could win battles of perception. Every escape, every successful ambush, every raid that struck deep into enemy territory reinforced the legend that Geronimo was invincible. The more impossible his survival seemed, the more his myth grew. And that myth became a weapon as sharp as any blade. In truth, Geronimo never commanded vast armies, never held great territory. He commanded something more powerful, belief. Belief among his warriors that they could face impossible odds. Belief among his enemies that they were never safe, never beyond his reach. This was the art of Apache warfare, an art that turned the desert into a battlefield no general could master, an art that made Geronimo not just a warrior, but a ghost that haunted empires. And yet, this was only the beginning. For as the legend of Geronimo grew, so too did the fury of the nations raid against him. The Mexicans could not stop him, the Americans, with their cavalry, their rifles, their endless resources, soon realized that Geronimo's war would not be easily ended. What happens when a man who cannot be killed is hunted by armies that cannot accept defeat? The next chapter of Geronimo's life would answer that question in blood and fire.